So in this demonstration, creating a data set, I'm firstly going to go ahead and introduce a new report. This will be a report-specific data set initially. So the way that I create a report might seem a little unintuitive. When you right-click the reports folder, you would think it's this one here, Add New Report. However, that launches that wizard, which most of the time is not what I want. So we need to go and take a different approach. We need to point to Add and add a new item. And that brings up a list of templates that we have available to produce reports from. And there is this base template here. You can create your own templates that can become the starting points for your own reports. So if you know that you want this certain layout and scheme, you would create that as a starting point. You would save it to a particular folder on the developer's machine, and then it would become available here as a template. Now, the report that I'm going to produce is called Sales by Product. And that essentially has added an RDL document into my project. It opens up the report in the report designer, and it's the report data pane that we'll first work with by saying, let's add a data source into this report. Now, while you can configure a report-specific data source, we now understand the use of a shared data source is the preferred practice. So the drop-down list here presents to me the two project shared data sources. What I do then is copy the name of that data source to make sure that the report data source is named the same. Then to create the data set, it's very simple. Right-click the data source and add a data set off that data source. And here you can see it's configured to use the shared data source in that report. My naming convention is to say this is the main data set that this report requires. Here is the option to introduce a query that could be text, or a store procedure could be used. Store procedures are a great practice as well, that encapsulating logic. The IT professional produces the store procedure, grants permission, and the end user simply consumes it. For now, I'm going to produce a text query. To launch the graphical designer, I click here, Query Designer. And because it recognizes this is the SQL Server data provider, it then presents to us the Relational Query Designer. I'm going to maximize the screen. Because there's actually 4 panes here. We have the diagram pane at the top, a grid pane in the middle, the SQL statement that's being produced, and then finally the results pane at the bottom. Let's start with the graphic approach first. So I click here to add tables in, and here are all of the tables, views, functions, and so on in the data source. This query is going to be about sales of products. So in my data warehouse, there's actually 3 tables, from category to subcategory to product, that define where the products come from. Date will be important because I need to filter by a date period. And then I have my internet sales. Actually, you know what? I think we'll go for reseller sales. When I click Add, it introduces those tables, and because there are foreign key relationships defined in the source, it automatically creates those relationships for me. So to make this a little clearer, we have from category to subcategory to product, and then we have the facts about those sales, and then we have a date dimension table. Alright, so a couple things to note here is that the AdventureWorks fact table here includes 3 date representations: ship, due date, and order date. It doesn't actually make sense to have 3 relationships happen at the same time. So I removed 2 of them to say that I'm only interested in the relationship between the sales and the order date. Now, as a result of this, if we take a look at our SQL statement, there's our from clause already built up. The introduction of the tables and the relationships produces our join clauses. Now, to introduce the select clause, we simply check the columns that we want to include. So from my category, I introduce English product category name. From subcategory, we have the English product subcategory name. The product has an English product name. And then I get to introduce from my fact table this measure here called sales amount. Now when I execute this query, we get to see the last pane come in, and you can see literally thousands of rows being retrieved from the database server. And you have to ask yourself, is this really a good thing to do? Do we expect the report server to query volumes of data? It's inefficient, not just for the data provider and the network, but also the report server, which then, for the purpose of my report, needs to aggregate that. It's far more efficient that we have the aggregation take place on the server itself. So that's where I would go ahead and introduce the grouping. So when I say group by, you'll see it automatically groups by all of these. And now I introduce the second pane. This does take a little while to get used to. And I say, instead of grouping the sales amount, let's just use the aggregate function of sum. All right, and now when I execute this query, I get far fewer rows back. I get the aggregation down to product level and the sum of sales for each product. Now you'll note that it uses an alias of expression 1. The column names or the aliases will become the field names in your report, so it's my strong recommendation that you name them something intuitive and concise for the purpose of your report design. So for example, this one here should just be called category. And this one is subcategory. And this one is product, and this one's sales. And now you can see the column names coming to our result, and that's because of the aliases that were introduced into the query. Now, a couple of other things. I know for a requirement that I also need the product key. I need the unique identifier for that product, so I introduce it, and I simply drag it up, because I like to keep things in some sort of logical order. And so now I have the product key in there as well. We'll see why I have that later on. And the next thing is, I'm not after all sales across all time, I'm after a particular time period. So that's where the dimension table here allows me to introduce the columns of, in this case, calendar year, calendar quarter, and the month number of year. All right, so now I'm getting a breakdown of my product by sales per particular month within the quarter within the year. Now, I don't want all years either. Initially, my purpose here is to introduce the 2007 quarter 1 data. So what I do here then is I say, well, instead of outputting that, we will just introduce that to the where clause. I don't need to see it, and then I will filter by 2007 quarter 1. And what we'll see then is that the where clause has been built up for me there. Okay, so do we need to know how to write an SQL statement? Not necessarily, although it does help. This graphic designer will guide you through producing a valid query. And then one last thing that I want to do is that month number of year. I'm just going to call it the month number. I like to keep my field names as short as possible. It's just easier at design time, and I want to push it up so it belongs above the sales amount. So I'm now at a point where I'm happy with the query. It brings back the data that I need, not too much, just right, and appropriate column names that will become the field names of my data set. So now when I click OK, essentially this select statement here gets copied into this query box. That's all the graphical designer is doing, is supporting the creation of that command. The fields then map directly to the columns that you have. And you can introduce calculated fields if you want. For example, I could multiply this column by this column. Usually it's my preference that the database engine does this because it's usually more efficient. I try to put as much work as possible on the data source so the report server simply consumes rather than has to aggregate and compute. But it is possible if necessary. We'll come back and talk about filters and parameters later on. And now when I click OK, we see the addition of the data set to my report design and its collection of fields ready for creating the layout of my report.